EMS, presented by Rob Theriault, Immersive Technology Manor, Center for Teaching and Learning at Georgian College. I'm going to pass it over now to our presenter. Rob, thank you so much for being here today to share your knowledge and experience with us, and we look forward to the presentation.
Thanks, Rio. It's a pleasure to be here and a real pleasure to speak with my EMS colleagues. So just quickly by way of background, I come from a paramedic background. I was in EMS for 35 years and taught paramedics for almost as many years, and introduced virtual reality into our paramedic program back in 2017, I think it was, maybe 2018, and then was able to persuade our school to build a virtual reality hub, just a small hub in our library, and then we did a demo. And that led to a discussion with our senior leadership team who wanted to know, from my perspective, where I thought virtual mixed and augmented reality was going in education. And I tried to make the case that one of the unique things about virtual reality in particular is that it's the only medium that I know of, educational technology medium, in which students can learn in the cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domain. And I felt it was very important to invest a little bit in it to begin to explore it and explore its pedagogical potential. And to my surprise, they agreed and decided to create a position for which I applied and now have been doing this for the last 3 years. And my goal was to get virtual reality, particularly virtual reality, into the hands of as many educators and students as possible. Like most paramedics, I'm very impatient. I like to make things happen quickly. I like to see results quickly. So that's the approach we've been taking, and we've done virtual reality on a really large scale. And I'll explain a little bit about what we've been doing at Georgian and try to focus primarily on the medical applications of virtual reality. But to begin with, I attended a conference in an NAEMSE conference, actually, in I think it was 2017, so 6 years ago, where I experienced patient simulation for the very first time. And after that experience, I was really left quite surprised at how I felt from the experience. As an educator, I'm always trying to think of how students could learn more effectively. And there's probably nothing more powerful than actual experience. And what I've discovered since then is that virtual reality can provide experience early on in the education of EMS providers. But the first experience, and I didn't know the terminology until after I began to study it for a while after this first experience. But the three sort of, in my mind, key pillars to the experience in virtual reality. One is this sense of presence, this being in another place that is different from the real world. So you look up, you look down, you look right, left, and behind you, and you're completely surrounded by an entirely different world. There's a feeling of spatial presence. When you're working collaboratively with other people in virtual reality, there's a social presence, that feeling of more intimate contact with people where you can see their eyes, you can see their mouth moving when you're speaking to them, which is very different from a Zoom call or a Teams call. And then there's what I like to call a physiological presence, where there's a visceral feeling, a visceral reaction. So for example, if you're standing on the edge of a cliff in virtual reality, you get the same fight or flight response that you would get standing on the edge of a cliff in real life. So it's very powerful, and our brains are fairly easily fooled by experiences that we have. And you know this if you work in simulation, that the objective is to give students a sense of suspended disbelief, and you can also do that in virtual reality. But the other superpower of virtual reality is context, that you can, in their first few weeks of training, you can actually take them into places that they would not be able to go unless they're doing field placement or clinical placement. So you can provide contextual learning, and that might be, in this case, a gymnasium or a shopping mall or the side of the road with cars rushing by. And that context is very valuable to learning because it gives them a sense of what the real world looks like. And the third thing is being able to do things with your hands, a sense of agency. So being able to feel a pulse, apply a blood pressure cuff, apply a pulse oximeter, etc. And when I had my first virtual reality experience for patient simulation, I was really surprised at how I reacted, because I was looking at someone who was struggling to breathe, and I could see his chest heaving as he tried to breathe, and I could see his lips were cyanosed and his skin was ashen, and he looked distressed. He had this look of anxiety on his face, and I could feel his pulse. I could take a stethoscope and listen to his chest, and I could apply blood pressure cuff and pulse oximeter and do other vital signs. I could walk to his night table and pick up his medications to see what other medical history he had if he was unable to communicate that to me. And when I came out of that virtual experience, the first thing that struck me was that I had the same little tiny twinge of adrenaline that I get as a medic when I think, okay, this guy is pretty sick. I need to assess him and treat him quickly before it gets worse. The second thing I thought of was that my students in the first few weeks of their training really don't get that kind of context. We might start to talk about case-based learning after the first semester, but really what they're looking at are bullet points on a screen. They're not seeing a patient who's actively in distress. And so virtual reality can provide that context and that sense of presence and that agency that's extremely powerful. And so we launched a series of pilots at Georgian College in a number of areas. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the areas where we're doing virtual reality, and then I'll come back to the paramedic program and sort of other medical simulations we've looked at. But shortly after I started my job as immersive technology manager, I discovered that architectural technology on the far left here of the screen was already using virtual reality, and their students were designing buildings in 2D and then going into a 3D environment and seeing their design from a 3D or a spatial perspective, which is really powerful because suddenly you realize, oh, this ceiling needs to be elevated 2 feet, and this hallway is ridiculously wide. You could drive a truck through it, so we can narrow it a bit. And this spiral staircase just doesn't belong here. So where can we move it to that would not affect the structural integrity of the building? The other interesting thing that I learned from architectural technology, I attended an event hosted by an architectural firm that talked about how they had been contracted to build a children's hospital. And what they did was they reduced their avatar down to the size of a 5-year-old so they could think of the design from a child's perspective. And that's really quite powerful. And Jeremy Bailenson from the Stanford University in his book, Experience on Demand, described one of the ways in which to think about virtual reality. And one of those ways is to think about it in terms of what can virtual reality provide as an education medium that would otherwise in the analog world be dangerous, impossible, counterproductive, or expensive. And you can add additional qualifiers like difficult, impractical, inappropriate. So for example, it would be inappropriate to take a group of EMS students to a crime scene to talk about crime scene preservation, or to a car crash scene, but you can do that in virtual reality. It's really incredible. On the right top of your screen, the second pilot we did, and now this is integrated into curriculum, was with our Indigenous Studies. They have 4 language courses: language in the home, the community, the workplace, and the natural environment. So we built worlds for them in virtual reality that gives context to the learning. So students in the language in the home course, for example, meet every Thursday. In virtual reality, they meet in a house and they have conversations in the house and outside the house. And that context is very powerful for stimulating the conversation. And it just makes sense. If you were going to learn conversational French in a cafe, why not actually do it in a cafe? So you can go anywhere in virtual reality. So these 4 photos that you're looking at are the 4 program areas where we've integrated virtual reality into curriculum so far. The others are all pilots. So the bottom right is maritime ship navigation. We have one of the world's largest ship simulators at Georgian College, where students stand on this very large, they come from all over the world, and they stand on this very large deck with wraparound video, and they learn how to pilot cruise ships and tanker ships. And now what we've done is we've got a number of students who can't come to Canada, so we send virtual reality headsets and computers out to shipping companies, and we meet with students in virtual reality. So they meet with a professor who is a ship captain and takes them through their last 4 to 8 weeks of training and preparation for their certification exams. I'd love to tell you the story about the one ship captain who was skeptical about the technology, if I get the chance later, if someone asks the question. In fine arts, this September, students are going to be learning how to do sculpting and painting in virtual reality. And there's a big market now for illustrators in virtual reality, for gaming, for virtual world building, and virtual reality in virtual reality in general. So students are going to be doing that. I'm pretty excited about that particular program. We've piloted virtual reality in about 20 other different programs, and I'll just list a few of them here. So tourism, power engineering, events management, soft skills development, anatomy. So we're just wrapping up a 2-year research study on the efficacy of virtual reality anatomy in 7 different program areas. Animal dissection for our veterinary technician program. Whoops, hang on a second here. Chemistry for our biotech degree. And this one we're not doing yet, but we explored FLAME, which is a firefighting virtual reality program, a mixed reality program, really quite incredible. So I think I mentioned we introduced virtual reality into our paramedic program, and the very first virtual reality application we used was a mass casualty incident triage program. And you know, when you think about Jeremy Bailenson's DICE principle, that dangerous, impossible, counterproductive, or expensive acronym, mass casualty incident triage makes a lot of sense in virtual reality, where students can respond to an incident, be it a plane crash, a train crash, a shooting, and begin to triage people. To do that in real life is somewhat impractical and very labor intensive. As you know, most schools, including our school, we do mock disaster once a year, every other year. And it involves months of preparation and finding student volunteers to be patient and doing moulage. And even still, it's one scenario and students get one opportunity to triage. But in virtual reality, not only can they do it multiple times, but you could, you know, once we get a sufficient number of scenarios, you can scaffold the learning in such a way that we can build stress resilience into their experience. So start with low acuity, low volume of patients, and work your way up. You can't do that in the real world in any practical sense. So I want to talk about virtual reality from a medical perspective, from a medical simulation perspective, so MedSim, from skills, from a perspective taking perspective, and from a communication simulation perspective. I talked about anatomy. That's another really good use case of virtual reality, where students stand in a life sciences lab and see a life-size anatomical model. I guess that could fall under medical simulation, but it's quite powerful. And we've had students who've said they didn't understand the axes of the body until they stepped into virtual reality and they could see it in 3D. And they also felt they were getting a hands-on experience during the pandemic, which was really quite good news to hear. So we've explored a number of virtual reality platforms, and I'm going to name drop a little bit here. There are lots of good platforms worth exploring. Some of them we haven't explored directly, but I've looked at, and it's early days. There are about a half dozen or so platforms that are really quite good and getting better all the time. And I think it's really important for us as educators to explore it now and begin to give feedback to enterprise about what we need from a pedagogical perspective and so on. So the first one that we piloted was a program from a company called SimX, based out of Los Angeles. And it's a moderator-based application where the those little bubbles you see floating around, those are real people in the world. All you're seeing is their head and their hands. And they're having a conversation with this patient. And I don't think you'll be able to hear the audio. Let me know, Rio, if you're able to hear the audio.
Yeah, I don't hear anything.
You're hearing it? Okay.
No, I'm sorry, I'm not hearing it.
Oh, okay. No matter. So, so anyway, they're having a conversation. They're eliciting a history from the patient. Right now, someone's feeling for a carotid pulse. They're auscultating the chest, doing assessments, and doing a resuscitation, in a simulated fashion, the way they would do in a lab. Only with this platform, you can do some, scenarios remotely, and you can use it in a number of different ways to supplement the theory component of the training. And I noticed there's some chat questions. We can get to those midway or towards the end. It doesn't matter to me, but I'll just finish talking about this particular simulation. So it requires a moderator, and you can get typically up to about 4 students in the virtual reality experience, and you feel like you're in the room. And it can be very powerful, but one of the most valuable components of these applications is that it comes with analytics that provides a breakdown of everything the student did, the sequence in which they did it. Did they provide the right drug, the right dose, right time, right route, etc.? And that allows the teacher the freedom to pay attention to, for example, the soft skills and the leadership skills, the situational awareness skills, and that's important. Let me show you another application here. This is from a company called Catechus, and it is a PCVR experience. So that means it's a virtual reality experience that requires connection between a virtual reality headset and a computer. I haven't used it myself personally, but I've spoken with the company and I've seen a number of demos and I've attended webinars, and it's a really great product from my estimation, and has lots of EMS type scenarios. And I know of a couple instructors who actually use this instead of a Zoom call. They go into virtual reality and they project what they're seeing to their students and have the students run the scenarios, and basically they do what their students tell them to do. So that's a kind of a neat concept. This next one here, some of you may be familiar with VR Patients. There are a lot of things I really love about VR Patients. The graphics are great. You can assess and treat patients. I'm not particularly fond of the drop-down list approach. In my mind, the best way to learn is to actually ask questions and have them answered rather than choosing from a list of questions, and to initiate treatments with your hands. So, even though the tactile fidelity may not be there for applying a blood pressure cuff, doing things with your hands is part of an embodied cognition experience, and you remember the sequence in which you do skills if you're doing them in virtual reality, even though, a pulse may just feel like a vibration in the controller. But one of the great things about VR Patients is that you can author scenarios in the background, and other companies, you have to partner with them and pay them a large sum of money to create new scenarios. So that's one of the versatilities of VR Patients, and they do have an EMS focus, which I really like. This next one is more of a nursing focus. It's UBSim, and I put the video in here because the agency with UBSim is really excellent. There are a lot of skills you can do, so you're doing a lot of things with your hands, and again, you're communicating with patients. They have standardized patients, so it doesn't require a moderator. You can run through a scenario, and the analytics will provide you and the teacher with feedback on what was done, the sequence in which it was done. There are also a number of communication simulators coming out on the market, and or simulators that incorporate voice recognition and artificial intelligence. And I really think this is the future of medical simulation in virtual reality is one, voice recognition, artificial intelligence, and analytics, and biometrics, which I'll talk about later. But the beautiful thing about this is that you can have a conversation with a patient, elicit a history, and when you ask her questions, she answers you the way a patient would. And if she doesn't understand your question, she'll say, I'm sorry, I don't understand. So it forces you to change the question or word the question differently. And which is exactly what happens in real life when either there's a language barrier or there isn't a language barrier, but the patient simply doesn't understand your question. And that's really powerful. And the analytics provides you feedback on what you asked and what you didn't ask. So if you forgot to ask about allergies, it's going to red flag it. This other one is from Health Scholars, and it's an interesting one. It also uses voice recognition and artificial intelligence. And it's kind of aimed at the advanced life support level where, for example, you have someone who's an avatar who's collapsed on the living room floor, and you've got a group of avatars standing around that person, and they each have name tags, and the student just simply tells the avatars what to do. So the student will say, Aaron, can you check for a pulse? Phil, can you start chest compressions? Fatima, can you defibrillate and start an intravenous line? And again, the analytics provides feedback on everything you did in the sequence in which you did it. Did you give the right drug, right dose, right time, etc. The other interesting thing about this one, and I learned about this application actually from an emergency room physician by the name of Dr. Tim Cobalt from Columbia, Missouri. And he uses this to supplement his simulation training with his ER residents. And the other thing that's interesting about this is it also evaluates your situational skills. So for example, the person who's doing chest compressions, the avatar doing chest compressions may start to slow down. Interestingly enough, it's exactly what happens in real life. And so you have to prompt the avatar to speed up or swap them out with someone who's not tired. The person who's doing bag valve mask ventilation may slow down or may ventilate too quickly. You have to have the situational awareness to recognize that and to make corrections. This next company is called Lumetto, and I quite like a lot of things I like about Lumetto: the agency, the graphics, and in particular, in the background, you can author scenarios, you can modify existing scenarios. So that's important for me as a Canadian. For example, you know, certain drugs that you administer in the United States, they go by a different name here in Canada. The dosing may be different. We use the international system, whereas, you know, for diabetics, you may use, you know, deciliters. Blood sugar levels, we use millimoles. And so I can change that in the background, which is really quite handy. Now, I mentioned agency. I'm not going to bore you with some of these stats. I mentioned agency, being able to do things with your hands. And learning the sequence of skills is really valuable, especially in the early days of training. And this was a small study, a randomized control study that was done with second-year medical students who, you know, obviously would have no medical or no surgical training. And they were randomized to either standard training for a surgical procedure involving putting a pin in the tibia, or virtual reality training. Now, standardized training or standard training involved videos, reading, a lecture. Virtual reality involved actually doing it. And in this trial, and albeit it's a small study, they found the percentage of steps done correctly in virtual reality versus standard was 63% versus 25%. And the knowledge retention of the surgical instruments in the VR group was 50% versus 11%. And that's, in my mind, quite a compelling proof of concept. Now, from a perspective taking angle, we've been exploring, as you know, the most difficult area to teach in any subject area is in the affective domain. The cognitive and psychomotor area is pretty straightforward, but teaching people to change their behavior or their values or their perceptions is very challenging. But virtual reality is an opportunity to do perspective taking in a way that was previously almost inconceivable. So there's been quite a bit of research on this topic in the Virtual Human Interaction Lab at Stanford University, mostly led by a guy by the name of Jeremy Bailenson, who is was the founding director of the Virtual Human Interaction Lab. And I recommend his book, Experience on Demand. And so, for example, if you take on the avatar, let's say you're a white person and you take on the avatar of an African American, within about 4 minutes, you begin to identify with that avatar. Part of your brain feels that this is who you are now. And to be able to take on the avatar of someone of a different gender or a different ethnicity, and be able to experience firsthand cultural microaggressions is very impactful, according to the research, compared to, say, a conversation in a classroom on that subject. To take on the avatar of a woman and be able to experience sexism firsthand, participate in the meeting, find yourself being interrupted, making a suggestion, having it dismissed, and then hearing a man in the room make the same suggestion and everyone's praising it, is a common experience for women. And getting to experience that firsthand can be very impactful. Stanford recently released this application, and it's free on the Oculus Quest, called the 1,000-Cut Journey. Very powerful. If you get the chance to try it, I highly recommend it. On the right side, there's something called the contact hypothesis that says that if you grow up in a particular community that's monocultural, it's easy to develop prejudices and racism. Whereas if you grow up in a very multicultural environment where it's not siloed in any way, shape, or form, you're far less likely to be racist or have prejudices. That's called the contact hypothesis. And on the right-hand side is one of our indigenous worlds. And one of our goals is to use it for sharing of cultural experiences and language learning for Indigenous speakers, but also to invite non-Indigenous peoples in there to mingle with Indigenous peoples to learn about Indigenous issues. The bottom left is something called Clouds Over Cedra, and it's a 12-year-old child's experience in a camp, and it was used at a United Nations event in 2015, I think it was, or 2016, where they were fundraising. Whoops, hang on a sec, let me go back here. They were fundraising, and they randomized participants at this event to just an information pilot on, or an information pamphlet and a brief conversation about what it's like to live in a refugee camp, versus the other group, which was exposed to a virtual reality experience from a 12-year-old's perspective on that refugee camp. And they found that the participants who participated in the virtual reality experience donated 3 times the amount of money as those people who just had a brief conversation about it and read a pamphlet about it. The bottom right is another application out of Stanford University called Becoming Homeless. And this is, again, an embodied experience, sometimes referred to as body transfer, where you get to experience firsthand what it's like to lose your job, find yourself with an eviction notice, having to sell things from your apartment, getting evicted from your apartment, and then eventually finding yourself on public transit with other homeless people. And that perspective taking can be very powerful. Some of the other applications that we're the good news is I'm almost at the end here, so we're going to be able to take a lot of questions. The other areas that we're communicating, that we're exploring rather, is around communication simulation in virtual reality. We've been doing a 2-year pilot with a product called Body Swaps, where you can role play for conflict resolution or for job interview skills, or equity, diversity, and inclusivity. So, for example, you might be sitting across the table from 2 people who have a conflict in their job, conflict with one another, and your role is to listen. And then you'll see drop-down lists that'll pop up periodically that'll ask you what would be the best verbal response at this point, and you choose A, B, or C. And then at the end, it records your voice, giving them feedback, and the teacher and the student can use that recording for a debriefing around, how would you communicate to that individual who was exhibiting sexist behavior or cultural microaggressions, or was really nervous in the interview process. And the classic response, for example, in an interview, when the interviewer asks a question, it's not uncommon for the interviewee to answer the question and then repeat the answer differently, and then repeat it a third time differently when the interviewer is looking for 3 different answers. But out of nervousness, people tend to repeat themselves and fail to score a maximum number of points. So you can do these kinds of role play simulations in virtual reality. In our policing program, and this is applicable for nursing and paramedicine, we're looking at de-escalation training. Again, something you can also do in virtual reality. So in summary, what I'd like to say is this: we're still in the early days of virtual reality, and I think it's important for us as educators to begin to explore its pedagogical potential. We've done it on a small pilot sort of approach. We have about 400 VR headsets. We piloted VR in over 20 programs, embedded it into curriculum in 4 program areas so far, as I mentioned. And now is a good time to be talking with enterprise about what our needs are from an analytics perspective, or a scenario development perspective, or the kinds of scenarios that we need for medical simulation, and so on. And so there's lots of really, really interesting potential for the future. And I want to talk about some of the, the key things that I look for. So, for example, I look for programs that work on a standalone virtual reality headset, so a headset that doesn't require a connection to a gaming computer. Although if you have a VR lab, a PC VR experience, so connected to a gaming computer, is not a bad thing at all. You get programs with higher graphics and greater detail. I also look for programs coming out right now that use artificial intelligence and voice recognition. And of course, with natural language processing and artificial intelligence, we're moving very quickly into an area where you can actually have a conversation with AI, and it'll feel, it won't be Stephen Hawking-ish too much. And, you'll be able to have conversations that would mimic conversations you might have in the real world. You'll find now with AI and voice recognition that there's, when you pose a question to a patient, there's usually a delay where the computer has to process it and provide a response. Being able to authorize the simulations in the back end, in my mind, is very important. Situations where the company wants to develop a scenario with you, and that's going to cost a lot of money, is just really impractical and can be cost prohibitive for schools. So I would say if I'm looking for software, I'm looking for software that has a sim authoring function in the background. The other interesting thing that's happening with some virtual reality headsets is free roam, which means that headsets have a software development kit that allows the programs to run where a VR headset can see another VR headset. So, for example, if I've got a 20-foot by 30-foot room, I might be able to have 6 students doing different scenarios in that room. But if I've got the same size room and I've got free roam VR where students can see where the other avatars are located, and those other avatars represent real people, we can get a dozen or more students in the same room. So that's an interesting area that there's very little of right now. Most of the headsets coming out now have something called pass-through video, which means you can see the real world and modify it using imagery, and that's going to be very powerful for 2 reasons. One, you don't get this disorientation that you might get in virtual reality, so you're able to see the real world and the real floor, but the mannequin you see is modified and looks like a distressed, sick, or injured patient. Augmented reality classes do that now, but the field of view is, in my personal opinion, too narrow. But with virtual reality glasses that have pass-through technology, I like to call it immersive augmented reality, you get a much more immersive experience. The other thing that's evolving right now is haptics, haptic gloves to give you a more realistic tactile perspective. You can get a haptic suit. So as a police student, you can experience what it's like to be shot. Obviously, it's not the same as being shot, but it's enough of a, between the visual experience of being shot at and the physical experience of experiencing that intense sting, it can be a very powerful illusion to working in a more developing a safer approach to active shooting scenes. And in medicine, obviously the tactile component is very important. Analytics, I mentioned already. The last thing I want to mention before I take questions is biometrics. A number of the more advanced headsets have biometrics, so gaze tracking, pupillometry, galvanic skin sensors, pulse, even grimace. And the combination of those biometrics allow us to do two things. One, we can quantify cognitive load, so we can design virtual reality experiences in a way that is a brief experience where they learn something in small chunks, the way learning should be done even if you're not in virtual reality. And secondly, we can quantify stress levels. And that's really exciting to me because we can provide scenarios at low levels of acuity and build upwards, scaffold the experiences so that we can build stress resilience into the experience. Now, you're never going to prepare the EMS graduate for, the murder-suicide call 2 weeks after graduation, but you can scaffold the experiences so they go to, let's say, a 2-car crash with 3 people injured, and work up to a 3-car crash with 6 people injured, and a 4-car crash with people more seriously injured, a shooter event where there are 3 victims, and then move up to one where there's 7 or 8. And so you can quantify their stress levels and individualize the experiences to build in stress resilience. And the potential for that, in my mind, is particularly exciting. So with that, I'm going to close off this session and take questions that you might have. And I think I'll just leave the slide up for now, if that's okay. I won't stop sharing my screen, but I'll start taking questions if that works for you, Rio.
Sure. So we have one question in the Q&A here. Somebody asked, when the students are making use of the VR headset, are they just interacting with the controllers for the VR, or would they be physically interacting with the simulation mannequin as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's a difference between virtual reality and mixed reality. Mixed reality experience would be one where you're interacting with the mannequin and wearing a virtual reality headset or an augmented reality headset. And so in my mind, that's going to be a very powerful means of running simulations, because you've got the visual, the auditory, the context, the sense of presence, but also the tactile component. That's going to be really valuable. The shortcoming of augmented reality glasses I found is that, it's because it's got a narrow field of view, it's like looking at the world through a business card. The real world is in your peripheral vision. The modified world is in this narrow field of view. So you might look at a mannequin and the head and torso looks like a real patient who's distressed, but in your peripheral vision, you just see the rubber mannequin. But with virtual reality glasses, with pass-through technology, you get a field of view that's 90 to 110% or better. And then you've also got that tactile component. So that mixed reality experience with physical objects, in my mind, the combination is going to be really incredible.
All right, and we have another question. Does Acadius require all users to have the headset PC combo, or can the instructor have the setup and the students still interact remotely when using it to replace a Zoom tutoring session?
Yeah, the latter, exactly. So yeah, the teacher can be in a PC VR experience and broadcast that 3D environment to the students through a Zoom call. And so, instead of having a PowerPoint case-based presentation the teachers in 3D, the students can see the 3D on a 2D screen, but they get a better sense of, a sick patient, and can give the teacher feedback on how to manage that patient. So yeah, it's one of the super cool things about a catechist.
All right. Benny asks, are there controls that allow for the patient to become aggressive, angry, or other emotions/reactions that we actually experience in some patients?
Yeah, I love that question. So this is the important thing about sim authoring. One of the nice things about good sim authoring is you can modulate the voice and you can modulate the behavior to become more aggressive or agitated or anxious or fearful. That I'm not sure about the physical actions of the mannequin. That may require work on the development side from the company itself, but on the voice side, you can, with Lumetto, for example, you can modulate that voice to sound more anxious or more calm. I'm not sure if you can modify it on the fly. That would be the ideal, to have a dial and dial it down. So, for example, the patient sounds really anxious, but you provide some reassurance and explain what you're doing, and then you dial it down a little bit and they sound a little more calm at that point. That would be the ideal, but at this point, I think you just sort of pre-program that in. So yes, that would be the ideal, but it's not a perfect system anywhere right now, but keep in mind that it does give you that contextual experience and that agency, which is very powerful.
Another attendee asks, have you reviewed the PERSIM system for med cognition?
No, I have not. So I can't speak to that. Is it a virtual reality experience or is it a 2D experience? I'm just looking up PERSIM as we speak. So holographic patient, frontline. Okay, I think I've seen this before. Yeah. So I think PERSIM uses a HoloLens too, and I'm not a fan of augmented reality for patient stimulation because you're just seeing one portion of the mannequin that looks like a real patient, and the rest of it doesn't. I much prefer virtual reality where you've got a much greater field of view, but the concepts are similar.
Adam asks, what was the name of the MIT lab?
Oh, it's a Stanford lab, and it's called the Virtual Human Interaction Lab. And if you go to the site, the Virtual Human Interaction Lab, they also publish all of their research studies there, and you can, it's a free download for the PDFs, which is fantastic.
Amanda asks, does a catechist require the student to have a headset on their computer if you wanted to use it instead of a Zoom session?
Sorry, ask that question again.
Oh, sorry. Amanda asks, does a catechist require the student to have a headset on their computer if you wanted to use it instead of a Zoom session?
Require no. But if you have a gaming computer and you can connect a VR headset to it, then you can go into the lesson in 3D. I'm just going to type in a link to my slides, by the way, for the group. So that's in the webinar chat for people who want access to that. I'm also going to send you a link to a list of VR applications that I've been curating for the last 3 years, and this will help with your exploration a little bit. So just typing in now my curated list. I also have, I'm going to give you one more list here. I've been curating a list of the research literature on simulations and virtual reality, not just medical, but sort of all VR. And I'm going to share that right now with the list, with the group. Were there other questions, Ria?
Yeah, so it looks like there's one more question here. And also I will be sure to include your links in tomorrow's follow-up email for everybody as well.
Okay.
Adam asks, Sometimes you have to choose between better graphics or better content. Which one provides the best experience to have the experience last so that it can be used in the real world?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer. I don't know the answer to that, but most systems operate on a standalone VR headset now. The graphics are pretty good in my experience, quite good actually, and the illusion is still pretty powerful. It's interesting. There's quite a bit of research around the affective VR and the sense of immersion that you get. I'll give you an example. So if you're in a virtual reality experience and you grab a blood pressure cuff and you put it on someone's arm, if that blood pressure cuff doesn't wrap around the arm properly, if it's like standing out like an inch away from the arm, you notice that as a student and as a teacher, and it's a really bad distraction. You lose your sense of immersion when you see that. So some of the details are important, and you don't necessarily need a PCVR system to create that level of fidelity. But yeah, you'll get higher graphics with a PCVR experience. And if you've got a VR lab or an XR lab, XR is an umbrella term for virtual mixed and augmented reality. If you've got an XR lab and you can cycle students through PCVR experiences, and the graphics are higher, great, I would say. There's people talk about this concept of an uncanny valley, where when the mannequins start to look really close to human but not quite human, it creeps people out. And I would say, you probably don't want to approach the uncanny valley for most simulations, but for medical simulation, you want them to look as close to real as possible, because the realism is really valuable for the experience. But I don't know if that answered the question or not, but.
All right, and I don't see any other questions yet. Yeah, Adam said that did answer his question.
Okay, good. Good. Yeah. The other thing I was going to say is I'm a big believer in peer learning networks. So if anyone wants to reach out to me on LinkedIn, connect with me and ask questions, I'm happy to meet people on conference call and answer questions and help you out. Paulo Coelho once wrote, "Sometimes we have to travel a great distance to find what is near." And I find that's very true in educational technology. You can search and search and search, and then you run into someone who says, "Oh yeah, just do this." And you think, why am I learning this now and not 2 years ago? So I learn a lot from other people exploring this space, and hopefully I can help others in this space as well. So I'm a big believer in collaborations and peer learning networks. So feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Rob. And there's just one more final question here from Adam. Oh, a couple questions. Okay. Adam asks, what is the cost of the XR lab, or an approximate cost to set up this type of learning experience for a group of 10?
Okay, well, in XR lab, we're talking in the tens of thousands of dollars. In terms of, computers and headsets, could be talking $40,000-$50,000. For a group of 10 for standalone headsets, the MetaQuest 2 headset is what most schools use. It's what we use mostly. They run about $400 USD per headset. So, do the math. We're talking about 4,000 for just the headsets. So it might sound like a lot of money. It's not a lot of money if you can get funding for it or grant funding for it.
Jana asks, are there opportunities to pilot any of these at a company?
You'd have to explore that on your own and find out what companies are doing. There are some VR gaming arcades You can certainly get a bit of an insight to it there if you've never tried virtual reality before. But otherwise, reach out to other surrounding schools, maybe see if anyone else is doing it. That's always helpful. We're collaborating with another school right now on paramedic scenarios. So that's helpful because we learn what they learn and they learn what we learn. Someone asked, I'll just come to this question. Someone asked about preventing PTSD. And the short answer is, I don't know. I think there's great potential in giving students experiences in a scaffolded way to build in stress resilience and actually quantify their stress levels that we've not been able to do before, except in a research setting. So I think there's potential there, and I think it's a low-hanging fruit research-wise for that kind of understanding. I'm just answering another question about the headsets. MetaQuest 2. MetaQuest 3 is coming out shortly. There's also the Vive XR Elite. That looks like a great headset. I hope to get my hands on one of those in the next few months. I was going to ask if there are any other questions, but I'm enjoying the awkward silence.
Definitely got a lot of good questions. That's fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are so many more things to talk about. I teach a virtual reality educator course. The next one is in October, if people are interested. You just, if you do a Google search for Georgian College virtual reality educator micro-credential, that's a lot of words. I don't think the October course has been posted yet, but it's a fun course. It's 6 weeks, 18 hours in total, mostly asynchronous, but we meet live once a week. The first and last week we meet in Teams, but the 4 weeks in between we meet in virtual reality. So you have to have a Quest 2 headset, and it's quite a bit of fun. So Adam's question, I love Adam's question. It's the classical question, has VR come far enough where we should spend money to build the lab? Will it go out of date? And the answer is yes, and the answer is no. It sort of depends on your risk threshold. If you ask me, my biased opinion is yes, build a lab, but it's not one of those build it and they will come situations. Build it and they won't come. They really won't come unless you need someone who has an education background, who can run an XR lab, who will find some compelling virtual reality or mixed reality experiences and go out to faculty and say, hey, you should try this for your museums and gallery course, or you should try this for your fine arts program, you should try this for your EMS program. So yeah, I think it just depends on how innovative a school wants to be. I think if you want to be innovative, if you want to keep on top of what's possible in experiential learning in virtual or mixed reality, then yes, you invest in it, you build a lab, you find grants to purchase the equipment, or find money from the state or the province, and you make it happen.
Right, does anybody have any final questions? Oh, Adam?
Going to post in my my LinkedIn connection here if anyone wants to connect with me. So there's a question here: would the schools let the fire service use or rent the lab? I don't see why not. I mean, you know, we have a couple of multi-purpose rooms. They're a combination of VR labs and classrooms. So when it's not being used for classes, it's being used for VR. I'm hoping to get a dedicated XR lab, and my hope is to use it for multiple programs, including fire. So yeah, when, you know, the teacher would just reach out to the lab and say, I'd like to schedule for Tuesday and Thursday to send my students your way. Can you accommodate them? That's what we would do. I'll give you my Twitter handle as well. I have two Twitter accounts. One is Paramedic Tutor and the other is EdTech Medic. The EdTech Medic is the one I'm on most of the time now. Is there a list of schools that have labs? Not that I'm aware of, Adam. One of the nicest labs I've seen is at Central Connecticut State University. They have a beautiful lab there. But you know what? You just do a Google search for university or college virtual reality labs in Indianapolis, and I'm sure you'll come up with something. Okay, it's called virtual. Yep, that's the course I'll be teaching in October. Oops, that should be micro, not mocro. I'll send you the link. Now, they don't have the October course listed yet, but here is the link to the micro credential. Only caveat is you need an Oculus Quest or Meta Quest headset. Yeah. Beautiful. Oh, Adam's asking, how does it compare to the metaverse? So the metaverse, by all accounts, is just a 3D web space. So it's the evolution of the web as a 2D experience and a 3D experience. So there are a number of web XR experiences now where you can go put a VR headset on, go to a web browser and find a 3D environment on the web. And, you know, I think the hope by a lot of people in enterprise is to develop a 3D web where you could experience in a virtual reality headset if you want. And where it's going to be most interesting is from a consumer perspective, to go into the 3D web where you can go, for example, to a sporting event and be right there at field level in your virtual reality headset that you might not be able to afford to do in real life, or a concert right at the stage, or and you can be at the stage with a group of other people, or you can just have your own private virtual reality booth at the concert. You can go shopping in virtual reality. You can try on clothes, and it'll, you know, if you've got an avatar that represents you, your height, your weight, etc., you'll be able to try on clothes. You'll be able to go to nightclubs, meet people. Right now in virtual reality, on a platform called VR Chat, you can get dance lessons. People are buying trackers to put on their wrists and their elbows and their knees and their ankles so that it tracks their full body movement in a high fidelity manner, and they can learn. There's a lady there who teaches belly dancing, and there's break dancing and all sorts of other dancing lessons. There's a deaf community in virtual reality. They use, instead of using controllers, they use the hand tracking function from the Quest 2 and other headsets. and they sign to one another in virtual reality. And there are sign language courses you can do in virtual reality. So there's also theater groups there performing live in VR, in avatar form, which is really something to see. So, you know, the future of both the metaverse and the things you can do in VR is really mind-boggling. Oh, so Adam was asking about competing. I don't see them competing. I see them running parallel, right? So I think, you know, 3D experiences are going to be for some days, and other days you kind of want to be there live. Like I can go to the, Petra in Jordan and see the carved out rock architecture in virtual reality, and the spatial experience is mind blowing. But I'd also really love to go there physically. Yeah, I was just reading from Amanda that FoamFrat uses spatial. I reached out to those guys. I was hoping to connect with them, and I should still try to connect with those guys because they're doing some cool stuff from what I can see, and they got the right idea. I think it's not just about seeing things in 3D and using the power of infinite scalability to look at, review things like the aldosterone renin pathway, but it's also, that context, that sense of presence, that sense of agency. I actually thought about teaching ECG interpretation in VR, because you can do 3D painting, and you can actually, I think it's my hypothesis that if you draw ECGs, you're more likely to remember what a second-degree type 2 AV block looks like than if you're just reading it and trying to remember that there's, X number of P waves and dropped QRSs and so on. So the potential in there is really quite mind-blowing. Yeah, I'm gonna have to check out FoamFrat again. That's super cool. All right, well, with that, I think we've gone over a little bit. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see, does virtual reality add something to 12 lead interpretation or rhythm interpretation? And, Amanda wrote, I'm not techy enough to build these worlds. And you shouldn't be, right? Like, teachers should not be expected to build worlds or create things in virtual reality. We should be able to take things that are fairly easy and intuitive to work, because we're, as teachers, we're content experts. Now, I'm a little bit nerdy and I like doing some of this stuff, but I wouldn't expect other teachers to do it.